So Daniel chapter 11 is where we're going to be, and I'm going to do my best with this setup, and hopefully the people online, you can hear me. And but we're going to be in kind of the second part of Daniel 11. And so last week we got a kind of a taste of how the prophecies of Daniel 11 were fulfilled, really down to like minute details of even things like murders of people and marriages, in particular. And the rise and fall of world leaders. We talked a lot about how there was like political cloak and dagger going on in Daniel, and we saw that last week. And so the prophecies of Daniel 11, verses 2 through 20, are really written as a way for God's people, the people of Israel then, to prepare for the coming of a really great crisis in the land of Israel, the coming of a man known as Antiochus Epiphanes. And so he's already been introduced to us in Daniel 8, so why do we have him described again in Daniel chapter 11? Well, first, Daniel 11 is going to add the dimension of giving us a timeline so that God's people would know kind of the season of when this persecution was coming. Or when it was close. Secondly, he's introduced again in Daniel chapter 11 for the kind of specific purpose of drawing a parallel between the persecution that he's going to bring, Antiochus Epiphanes, in Daniel 11, 21 to 35, and then the persecution under another figure, Antichrist Epiphany, which is kind of the end of Daniel 11. There's differences of opinion in scholars today, and so some believe that the last 10 verses of Daniel 11 are really just like a recapitulation of the previous 15 that we're going to look at today. But I'm kind of convinced that that's not true, and we're going to look at that today. So for this morning, what we're going to do, because we have a little bit shorter time, is we're going to focus on Antiochus Epiphanes in Daniel 11, 21 to 35, and then later this week I am going to send out like a video follow-up kind of covering the second half of this portion of Daniel 11 in 36 to 45. But what I want you to notice in both today and then hopefully the video that you'll see later this week is that in both cases we are called to a particular response to what's going on in the world and in particularly in persecution. So the first crisis that we're going to look at, that the people of God have to face, takes place under the rule of Antiochus IV. Now, if you've been following Daniel at all, you know there's like a ton of names, and it's a little bit confusing, and I'm there with you, so just do your best to follow along. And part of what I'm going to say is coming from historical record, part of that I read about in commentaries and as I study, and then part of it is coming from the text itself. So this first crisis takes place under the rule of Antiochus IV. And what we see is this important verse in verse 32 of Daniel 11. It says, he shall, meaning Antiochus, he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. And this is the key that I want you to hold in your head. It's a thread that's going to attach again later at the end of our time today. But the people who know their God will stand firm and take action. Now, who they were called to resist was a very powerful, contemptible, deceitful person in Antiochus Epiphanes. He's described in verse 21 of Daniel 11 as a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. So like he doesn't have the character for the office, is kind of what it's saying here. He's described as a contemptible person. His contemporaries really considered him a kind of an erratic type of guy. He was glorified in his title of Epiphanes. So his name is Antiochus, his title is Epiphanes, and that title means the manifest God. And so many, though, preferred behind his back, of course, because of his character, to call him Epimanes, which means a madman. So his title that he wanted to be called was Manifest of God, and what they actually called him, which kind of sounded the same in the language, is crazy person. Right? And so he was praised to his face, and then behind his back, he was pretty generally despised and feared because of who he was. Now, you might remember that from last week that Antiochus IV, who's the younger son of Antiochus the Great, he is taken captive to Rome along with 19 other men. And so he wanted the throne of his father, but he was, like it said there, not given the honor of royalty. But his brother was. So when Antiochus IV finds out that his brother is on the throne, he escapes Rome and he makes his way back to his own country of Syria. And you might remember last week there's the northern and the southern kings, and that's still where we are. And so the authorities, when he gets back to his own country, the authorities in the Seleucid kingdom don't want him to be king. They don't desire to have him be king. So he makes a deal with the king of a place called Pergamum, who gives him money and supplies in order to enter into Syria, where he takes over the kingdom by kind of clever maneuvering and political violence. So that's what's happening here in Daniel. Daniel puts it this way in verse 21. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Now, he comes back as the long-lost brother, so to speak, and he's hoping to arrive and help his royal brother secure the kingdom. He comes with the appearance of being a friend. He takes his brother and his kingdom completely by surprise because they're not expecting anything like this. In verse 22, Daniel adds this: armies shall be utterly swept away before him, and broken even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people. So this then is describing when he kills his brother, and with just a handful of men he brought back from Rome, he takes the throne. And so Daniel 11:24 then describes more of his character. Without warning, he shall come into the richest part of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. So one of the things that Antiochus Epiphanes loved to do was to loot the treasuries of temples, because he considered himself divinity. He considered himself a god with a little g. And so he would then take the plunder from those temples and walk through the streets, taking the silver and the gold and throwing it to people in the streets. And he would, reportedly, he would laugh at them as they would grab, because, people need money. And so he would laugh at them as they throw themselves on the ground to collect the silver and the gold. But his best friends always received kind of the best gifts. So a little bit of nepotism and kind of, insiderness going on. And so he's this really incredibly arrogant, deceitful king. And so in Daniel, that section ends by saying, he shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. Again, just another subtle little reminder of God's sovereignty, that even for a seemingly, in this moment, undefeatable king, his days and his actions are numbered by God from the very start. Like Daniel's just putting that little nugget in there, and I love that. So let's think about then his sort of political career of Antiochus. It starts to get described in verse 25. Look at verse 25 and 26. And he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. So here's what's going on according to kind of the historical record. To put some names to this. Antiochus' sister, who you might know as Cleopatra, had been the queen of Egypt since her husband died. Then when she dies, her teenage son, who's now Ptolemy VI, becomes the king of Egypt. The advisors of this king, of this young king, gather a huge army with the intentions of trying to conquer the land that is sort of Israel and southern Syria. And when Antiochus IV hears this, he quickly himself marches against Egypt. He defeats the Egyptian army. He takes possession of his nephew, Ptolemy VI, and he made the Egyptian ruler's brother Ptolemy VII, king instead. So again, a lot of names, a lot of kind of political maneuvering going on here that is talked about in Daniel. But instead of using force to restore Ptolemy VI to power, Antiochus Epiphanes decides to use a version, at least, of diplomacy. And so he sits down at the table with Ptolemy VI and Antiochus, and they sit down together. And as is the case with powerful people, both of them had their own plan in mind. Okay? And they have different plans, and so they actually end up deceiving one another right? And so verse 27 says this, "And as for the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed." So here's just a quote from one commentator describing this sort of failed political deal. It says this: "The youthful Egyptian king would try to persuade his uncle that if the invaders would leave Egypt, its people would rally around the legitimate king, and he would then rule Egypt in friendly fashion and would give Antiochus whatever he might desire. Antiochus the uncle then would falsely declare that his only purpose was to secure the legitimate rights of his nephew. And so the two kings would then, quote, sit at the same table and lie to each other. As predicted, the schemes of both men failed. Antiochus, thinking himself a master of strategy, put trust in the lying promises of his nephew and withdrew his forces from Egypt. As soon as he had done so, his nephew made peace with his brother, Ptolemy the VII, leaving Antiochus without any power in Egypt. Yet the plans of Ptolemy VI also failed, for the supporters of Ptolemy VII didn't give their full support to Ptolemy VI, but insisted that the two brothers reign as joint kings, leaving Egypt in a state of weakness." Sounds pretty politically familiar, right? It's crazy. It's not new. Nothing new under the sun, as the preacher would say in the scriptures. So Daniel 11:28 then says this. It goes on, "And he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant." That's a reference to God's people. "And he shall work his will and return to his own land." Okay, so now this is talking about Antiochus again. So on his way back to Syria, Antiochus stops in Jerusalem with, quote, his heart set against the holy covenant or God's people. He declares a few laws changed and then he leaves. So what is he doing? He's attempting to sort of bring the Jewish people in line with the Hellenistic patterns of life and culture that he is a part of. So he returns home. He realizes what's happened. His nephew has deceived him. And so we see in verses 29 and 30 that Antiochus assembles his navy. He sails the Mediterranean Sea along the coast of Israel until he comes to Egypt to deal with this problem. He docks his ships in the harbor of Pelusium near Alexandria, where his nephews were, and he is met there by another navy. He looks on the ship and he sees a familiar flag. These are people from Rome that he knows. And so the man who is from Rome who approached his camp was Gaius Linus, who happens to be his dear friend from when he was in Rome. And they had spent years together in Rome while Antiochus was in exile, so they're buddies. He's glad to see him. He's thinking, great, I'm going to enlist his help against the Egyptians. But Gaius is not smiling. He instead takes out a decree written on a piece of paper or papyrus or whatever it was written on, and he has a written decree coming from the Senate of Rome. So the leadership of Rome, and they're telling Antiochus Epiphanes, leave Egypt alone, disband your navy, and go home. Like, that's it. We're done with this, right? And so according to historical records, this is kind of funny, Antiochus tells Gaius, well, I want some time to think about this, as if you can negotiate with Rome in this day, right? I want some time to think about the proposal. And so Gaius apparently takes a stick and draws a circle around Antiochus and says, you can have all the time you want, but you can't leave the circle until you give me an answer, right? And there's only one acceptable answer, by the way. And so Antiochus decides to do what the Roman Senate had asked, which, if you're living in this time period, smart, because you don't want to go up against Rome. So he gets back on his ship, and he orders his troops to leave Egypt at once. And really, what you see in Daniel is this prophecy that this man tries to conceal his anger, but we know what his character is. He's a proud man, right? He thinks he's a god, and he just was humiliated in front of his own men, his own soldiers. So how do you think he's actually feeling on the inside? He's furious, right? He's angry, and he's looking for a place to vent that anger, as somebody who has bad character might do if they have this much power. So he remembers that he has a stop he remembered the stop he made in Jerusalem and what he considered to be kind of the arrogant confidence of the Jewish people. He didn't like the people of the covenant. That's what Daniel said. And so he goes back to Jerusalem on his way. And verse 30 tells us this: he shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention or give favor to those who forsake the holy covenant. So the soldiers of Antiochus, they draw their swords when they get to Jerusalem, and they promised favors of gold and silver to all who forsake the covenant. Right? They're coercing people to forsake God's covenant. And for those who will not do it, they give, the historical record shows, immediate beatings. They give them imprisonment. They kill some of them. Soldiers were even sent out with orders to kill women who had their boys circumcised and to compel every Jew to sacrifice to Zeus, which is just heresy to them, right? So the regular ceremonies and sacrifices of the temple were stopped for a time, and an altar of Zeus was placed above the altar of God. This is the abomination that Daniel talks about. So it pollutes the sanctuary so that no Jews, no pious Jews will go there or worship there. But as happens, many of the Jewish people give in to this pressure, right? They give in instead of facing persecution, because Antiochus, he is harsh if you oppose him, but if you're with him, he shows favor to those who forsake the covenant. This is what Daniel prophesied in verses 31 and 32. But we also see something else. We see that Antiochus can be, in his own way, a winsome, sort of charismatic person. He flatters people to win their favor. So be careful with flattery if you hear it, right? He gives silver and gold to those who deny their belief in the God of Abraham, to those who forgot what God had done. He's like, hey, if you deny this God, I'll give you silver and gold. And apparently thousands of Jews did this, bowing their knee to Antiochus, bowing their knee to his god Zeus. But also thousands defied him, and they were killed by the sword, and others resisted by force, which is also prophesied. Now, one of those who resisted by force, or who kind of led a resistance against Antiochus, was an old priest named Mattathias. And when the king's soldiers try to force everyone in his hometown to sacrifice to Zeus, Mattathias forcibly resisted them and pulls down the pagan altar. That's pretty sweet stuff. This is a tough guy. I like Mattathias, right? He and his 5 sons, then they flee into the desert where other groups of people are hiding, and they kind of have this community together. And not only did this old priest resist the soldiers, but he also instructed others. He didn't just sit out there in the desert, but he teaches. Daniel writes that those who are wise will instruct many. This is an allusion or a reference to them. Wisdom in the scriptures is always associated with God's word. So if you're wise, you're filled with God's word. So part of Mattathias' instruction was to show these people, you got to believe that part of what he's instructing them in is showing them how God had predicted this very oppression, so that these people would be encouraged, because ultimately they're going to end up being victorious over this man, Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, when Mattathias dies, his son, Judas Maccabeus, and some of you have heard of the Maccabean revolt, becomes the leader of this sort of band of rebels, and he demonstrates like an unusual military ability. There are just leaders in history who are just really good militarily, and he apparently is like that. As prophesied in verses 33 and 34, it says this: "For some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder, and when they stumble, they shall receive a little help." So what this is saying is that even though they received virtually no help from their Jewish brothers who had been deceived, they hold out hope for victory because they had been taught and knew that Daniel had promised these losses would just be for a time, as we talked about earlier, that the days were numbered. So the last phrase of verse 34 is kind of a warning to the wise: "And many shall join themselves to them with flattery." So when the Maccabees began to achieve military success and push back against Antiochus, some who were, quote, not sincere joined them, because it's easier, right, than being where they were. Some who joined the cause didn't do so for the sake of God, but instead they joined this cause for selfish reasons that were not in line with being one of God's covenant people. And so the battle against these Syrian forces is going to be difficult. Antiochus continues to use flattery. He's trying to gain support for his cause, even from among the faithful, and at times it works. Flattery works sometimes. Daniel says in verse 35, "And some of the wise shall stumble." so that they may be refined, purified, and made white. Now, I just want to pause there. If you have in your mind some version of following God that's like, if I fail, I'm out, I just want you to hear that verse again. Some of the wise, those who were with God, will stumble. Why? Why do they stumble? So God can kick them out because he's mad at them and hates them? No. Why do they stumble? So that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. I love that little nugget of just redemption right there. The last phrase of Daniel 11:35 really had to be the most encouraging of all to them in this prophecy. Until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. Now, we, in our Western sort of modern world, having been influenced by things like the Enlightenment and evangelicalism, influenced by things like Left Behind, right? We hear the end, and what do we think of? The apocalypse and the end of time, and right, all that stuff. But the end in scriptures does not always refer to the end of the world. And that's not what it's referring to here. This is a case where the end specifically refers to the end of the reign of Antiochus that would come at the, quote, appointed time. These words were given so that this people who are reading this prophecy when it's happening will not lose heart in the midst of the persecution and difficulty that they're dealing with. Now, just as we kind of wrap for today, at the end of verse 32, I just want to go back to that little gold nugget that we talked about at the beginning. Listen to this. But the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. Right? The people who know their God will stand firm and take action. So Antiochus is not the first, and he will not be the last world leader to persecute God's people or to attempt to lead them astray. Notice who are the ones who are able to resist this opposition. What does it say? Those who know their God. There have been times in virtually every age and virtually every place where it was very hard to be a Christian. In our own country, there are streams of Christianity that have been persecuted in this country from its beginning. But only those who know God will what? Firmly resist and even take action, it says. The Apostle Paul said this in Philippians 3, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. Now, I had this professor in Bible college who used to use this illustration. I guess I've been here as a pastor long enough now that I'm probably recycling illustrations without realizing it. So here we go. I don't remember if I've said this before or not, but some of you might. But he said there's two ways of knowing, right? So imagine you're and this is a little bit gruesome to think about, but he says imagine you're a person who loves cats, right? You just love cats. You get a kitten. You're like, oh, I love this kitten. I want to know this kitten. So you're like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to taxidermy the cat. And I'm going to take it apart and open it up and look at it, and I know everything about this cat. I know where its organs are. I know where its nerve endings are. Man, I know this cat. Now, that's one way of knowing, right? But if you're a cat person, that's not the way you want to know the cat, right? There's another way of knowing, which is you love the cat, you pet the cat, you have the cat for 15, 20 years because cats live that long for some reason, and you feed the cat, and you know right where the cat likes to be scratched, and you get the special little toy, and oh, this cat likes this kind of catnip, but not, right? That's knowing as much as the other is knowing. And a lot of us think that there is a direct correlation. Well, there is a correlation, but a lot of us think that it's a replacement of the second kind of knowing for the first. So we think if I just know a lot about God, then that means I know God. And while you have to know about God to know God, it's not necessarily true that the one is the same as the other. Let me give you another example. Sports, right? Gunnar Henderson, amazing. Shortstop for the Orioles. Incredible, right? One of the best players in the game right now. Some of us in this room know his stats. All right? Some of us in this room probably know a lot of stats about sports figures, but we don't know Gunnar, right? And we might know a lot about him, right? He swings a sweet left-handed swing, right? Makes great plays at short, but I couldn't walk up to him and be like, hey, Gunnar, that'd be weird. So there's a way of knowing, and then there's a way of knowing, right? And so knowing all of Gunnar Henderson's stats does not mean that I know him, right? But I know a lot about him. So When the Apostle Paul says, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection, he's talking about mainly that second kind of knowing relationally. And so this is the takeaway from this text that I just want to leave us with for today. And I want you to feel a sense of urgency, because persecution is something that in the scriptures and in the history of the church, we always see as a potential. It's always potentially going to happen. And so now is the time to grow in knowing God, which means if you are constantly finding reasons why, I just don't have time to study my scriptures, or I'll get to it later when I can. When it comes to knowing God, friends, you are already being deceived and manipulated by the enemy of your soul. That is the battleground, right? And the enemy of your soul is operating in the same spirit as Antiochus Epiphanes was. So the time to prepare for a coming crisis is not during the crisis. Right? I grew up in Florida. We have hurricanes there. I know we get them here too, but in Florida we get them. And this time of year, they get really bad. And every single time a hurricane is actually going to hit and make landfall, there are always the people who thought they would be able to just kind of get ready when it came. And every time there are people who are unable to survive the storm when it actually hits because they were not prepared ahead of time. You can't prepare for a hurricane when it's on top of you. So each day we are given is a day we are given to pursue knowing God. Now, how do we do that? Well, I know that we know this, but there's just a number of ways that as a church we want to help facilitate that, right? So this Sunday gathering is one of those ways. It's like the most basic entry point into the journey of knowing God. It's like our public facing, hey, this is how you start to follow God. You come and join in the life of the church that gathers here. And so if you want to begin that journey, just simply start by just make this a priority. And I'm not going to give you a number of Sundays a month or whatever. I'm not saying in any kind of guilt or judgment that if you're not here every week, then, none of that. I never want to use manipulation or judgment, just an invitation. So if you want to know God, just think about making this a priority. But the other side of that is some of us need to just hear. Like some of us need to be invited, and some of us just need to hear, hey, coming once a month and thinking you're going to grow is kind of foolish. It's just not the reality of the world. Small group on Thursday night is another facet that can facilitate your growth in knowing God. For some of us, it's really important. I can't tell you how many small groups, and I'm guilty as the pastor, right? Thursday about 3 o'clock, I'd roll around and be like, I don't want to do this. Right? But then I'm like, first of all, I'm the pastor, I got to do it. But second of all, I go and I think to myself afterward, I'm really glad I was part of that discussion, that conversation that we had on Thursday night. Coming soon in October, we're going to have the first of hopefully many courses that we are working on. The first one is going to be how to read the Bible in context. We're going to use Romans as a case study. That's, again, another way to grow in knowing God as you learn how to study the scriptures better. Now, listen, none of these are silver bullets. There's no magic wand I can wave and just make it so you know God. It's a lifetime pursuit. These are just examples. The real issue is your willingness to hear the call of God to move towards him, which grows your knowledge of him. And growing your knowledge of him is a way that you grow in knowing him, which is what Daniel is getting at. So knowing about God and knowing God are not necessarily the same. So for you church folks, right, that's me. I grew up in the church. I probably know more Bible than I even realized because it's just ingrained in there, which I'm thankful for. But the shadow side of that, if you've been coming to church your whole life, this is your invitation too. You're not exempt from growing in your knowing of God because he's infinite. You can never run out. So that's just what I want to leave you with today. And as the week goes on and I send out the video seeing that parallel, I just want this again to be just kind of the response we see. Now is the time to grow in your knowledge of Christ. It's always now is the time. The invitation is always there because only those who know their God, like Daniel said, will be able to firmly resist the evil days that we live in. Let me pray. Jesus, we thank you for this time. We thank you for just the life of our church we saw today, with hearing from what you're doing through those who are connected to us across the world, from seeing our kids up here, as rambunctious as they are, but Lord, they're a blessing, and we're so glad for them, and we're so glad to be part of a family that has a church family that has kids around. And so, Lord, again, we thank you for all the things that you are doing in our church family to bless us and to grow us. And I just ask that this would just be an invitation to, again, dive into knowing you, whether that be first and primarily through prayer or gathering or reading your scripture, or hopefully all of it, Lord, that you would just grow in us a desire to want you more and to know you more. And Lord, that would have an effect on our lives, and that others would see that and want the same thing. And so we pray all this in your name. Amen.